Mhm. My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, which should have been my first warning sign. She never called on Tuesdays. She texted. Short messages, usually about logistics. Can you pick up Dad's prescription? The pharmacy closes at 6. Or, don't forget Grandma's birthday is this weekend. Phone calls meant something was either very wrong or she wanted something she knew I might say no to. Megan. Her voice was warm in that particular way it gets when she's already decided something. We've been thinking about Thanksgiving. I was standing in my apartment in Sudbury, still in my work clothes, a half-eaten granola bar on the counter because I'd skipped lunch again. I taught grade 4 at St. Anne's Elementary. October meant parent-teacher interview prep, report card comments, 3 kids in my class who still hadn't been assessed for learning support. I was tired in the specific way that teachers get tired in October. Not physically worn out, just hollowed. Okay, I said carefully. Your father and I thought it would be so special to do a proper family gathering this year, all of us together. You, your brother, us, Grandma Irene. She paused. At the house in Huntsville. Grandma Irene had lived alone in Huntsville for 11 years, ever since Grandpa passed. The house was a 2-story on Peninsula Road, right on the water. She was 79. She had bad knees, a heart condition. She downplayed constantly, and the stubbornness of a person who had survived things that would have broken most people. That sounds really nice, I said, and I meant it. We're so glad you think so, sweetheart. Something in the phrasing landed strangely. We're so glad you think so. Not great, we'll all drive up together. Not your father wants to leave early Friday to beat the traffic. Just that slightly off-center response that didn't quite connect to what I'd actually said. I almost asked. I didn't. I drove up to Huntsville the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. My brother had said he'd come Thursday morning, my parents Thursday afternoon. Grandma Irene had asked if I could arrive early to help her prep the turkey, which was honestly the part I was most looking forward to. She made the stuffing from scratch with sage from her garden, a recipe she'd learned from her own grandmother in rural Nova Scotia. And every year I stood at the counter beside her and tried to memorize the way she measured things. By feel, by smell, by something she couldn't quite name. The drive up Highway 11 was beautiful. The maples had turned, and the light hit them in a way that made everything look like it was lit from the inside. I had coffee in a travel mug and a podcast on that I wasn't really listening to, because I was just watching the trees. I pulled into Grandma's driveway around 4 o'clock. Her porch light was already on even though it wasn't dark yet. She did that when she was expecting someone, turned the light on early so you'd know you were expected. She met me at the door before I could knock. There she is. She took my face in both hands, the way she'd been doing since I was small, and looked at me with this particular expression that I can only describe as full attention. Like I was the only thing in the room. You look tired, Megan. I'm okay, Grandma. You're allowed to be tired. Come in. The house smelled like it always did. Wood smoke, and something faintly floral, the lemon soap she kept by every sink. I dropped my bag by the stairs and followed her to the kitchen, where she had the stuffing ingredients already laid out. We cooked for 2 hours, and she told me about her neighbor's dog, who'd been getting into her garden, and a book she'd been reading about the early settlement of Cape Breton, and a letter she'd received from a woman she'd gone to teachers' college with in 1967, who was now living in Portugal. I told her about my class, about the boy named Olivier who was reading 3 grade levels ahead and spent recesses reorganizing the class bookshelf by color, instead of author, which was technically wrong but showed real aesthetic commitment. She laughed at that. A real laugh, not a polite one. Around 6, I set the table for 5. She watched me for a moment from the kitchen doorway. Your parents called this morning, she said. And her voice was the same. But something behind it wasn't. Yeah, are they leaving earlier than planned? She was quiet for a second. They're not coming, sweetheart. I set down the fork I was holding. Your brother either. I turned around. She was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed loosely, not in an angry way, but in the way of someone who's bracing themselves a little. What do you mean they're not coming? Your father got a deal on flights. Apparently there was a seat sale. She said seat sale the way people say words they're quoting rather than speaking. They've gone to Portugal. Your brother and his girlfriend went with them. They left this morning. I stood there in her dining room with 5 placemats on the table and I did the math. They would have booked those flights weeks ago. The seat sales that get you cheap transatlantic fares in October, those don't appear the day before. You plan for those. You watch for them. They had known. When my mother called me on that Tuesday in early October with that particular warmth in her voice, she had already known. They didn't tell me, I said. It wasn't a question. No. Grandma Irene looked at me steadily. I don't think they intended to. I sat down in one of the dining room chairs. The stuffing was in the oven. There were 5 placemats on the table. The porch light was on. They asked me not to tell you until you were already here, she said. They thought if you knew ahead of time, you might not come. I looked up at her. They were right, I said. I know. She came and sat down across from me. I'm sorry, Megan. I should have called you myself. I kept thinking they'd change their minds. She paused. Or that they'd at least have the decency to tell you themselves. We sat there for a moment in the quiet house. Then she said, I'm glad you're here for what it's worth. I'm glad it's you. I stayed. There wasn't really a question about it once I sat with it for a few minutes. I thought about calling my mother, and I did draft that conversation in my head. The controlled, deliberate version where I said exactly what I thought without raising my voice, but I didn't make the call. Not that night. One daughter is a doctor. 1 daughter and 5. The Esther-free placemats off the table. Fold them. Put them back in the sideboard. Reset for 2. Found a candle in the cabinet above the fridge. Opened the wine I'd brought. Grandma Irene watched all of this without commenting, which was one of the things I loved most about her. We had Thanksgiving dinner by candlelight, the 2 of us, with the lake just barely visible through the window in the last of the gray October light. We talked for a long time. Not about my parents, not yet, about other things. Her life. Things I'd never thought to ask before. She told me that she'd wanted to be a doctor, that in 1963, when she was 20, she'd applied to the University of Toronto's medical school and been rejected. Not because her grades were poor, they weren't, but because the faculty had a quota on women applicants. She'd found out years later from someone who'd been on the committee. 2 of the men admitted that year had lower marks than she did. She became a teacher instead. Taught high school biology in North Bay for 31 years. I loved it, she said simply, but I always wondered. She told me about the early years of her marriage, when she and my grandfather had almost nothing. A 2-room apartment in Barrie. His apprenticeship at the tool and die shop. Her first-year teaching salary of $6,000 a year. How they'd saved carefully, bought the Huntsville property in 1981 for what seemed like a lot of money at the time. How the lake had been the reason. She'd wanted the kids to have water. My mother and uncle had grown up in that house. I asked her what she missed most about my grandfather. She thought about it for a long time before she answered. The way he read the newspaper, she said finally. He read every section, even the classifieds. He said you could understand an entire community just from its classifieds. She smiled. He was probably right. That night, I slept in my old room, the one with the quilt she'd made herself in shades of green and blue that I'd slept under every summer as a child. I lay there, listening to the lake, that particular silence that is somehow fuller than city silence, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Present. That's the word. Just present. The 4 days of Thanksgiving weekend were the most time I'd spent alone with my grandmother since I was a child. We fell into an easy rhythm. She was an early riser, up by 6, coffee made before I came downstairs. I'd find her at the kitchen table with her book, and she'd look up and say something like, "The Blue Jays are back," or "It's going to rain by noon." And we'd sip together while the coffee got warm in our hands. Her knees were worse than she let on. I noticed she held the railing on the stairs, moved slowly in the mornings. Once, when she thought I wasn't watching, I saw her press her hand against the small of her back after standing up from the garden. "Have you told your doctor about the back?" I asked. "It's fine, Grandma. It's an inconvenience," she amended, "not a crisis." But I watched her more carefully after that. Made sure I was the one who carried things, who got the items from high shelves, who drove when we went into town for groceries Saturday morning. She let me without making a fuss about it, which told me she was more tired than she was saying. We went to the Huntsville Farmers Market on Saturday. She knew half the vendors by name. A man named Gord, who sold maple syrup and had known her for 20 years, asked after her family, and she said pleasantly that her granddaughter was visiting for the long weekend and pointed at me, and Gord looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. "Good," he said. Just that. Good. On Sunday it rained, and we stayed in, and she taught me to play cribbage, properly, with the board her father had carved from birchwood sometime in the 1940s. She was ruthlessly good at it. She counted her hand with the focused expression of someone doing something they've done 10,000 times. "You let me win that one," I said after I won a game. "I absolutely did not," she said with great dignity. I called my mother on Sunday evening. I kept it short. I said I'd been there since Wednesday, that Grandma and I had had a lovely Thanksgiving, that I hoped Portugal was nice. My mother said the weather had been perfect and the food was incredible, and that she was glad it had all worked out. All worked out. Like it had been a scheduling conflict that resolved itself. I said I'd talk to her when she was back in the country. I hung up before she could pivot to something else. Grandma Irene was sitting at the kitchen table when I came back in. She'd heard enough of that to understand the shape of it. "You're not going to yell at her?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "Maybe not at all. I haven't decided." She nodded, considering. "Your grandfather never yelled either. He said silence was more effective. That most people fill silence with their own guilt eventually." I thought about that. Was he right? "Usually," she said. "Not always." I drove back to Sudbury on the Tuesday morning after Thanksgiving. I hugged Grandma Irene in the driveway for a long time. She smelled like her lemon soap and her wool cardigan. "Come back at Christmas," she said. "If you want. I want." She patted my arm once and then she went back inside, and I watched the porch light through my rear-view mirror until I turned out of her street. The school year moved fast, the way it always does after Thanksgiving. Suddenly you were at Halloween. Then Remembrance Day. Then the desperate sprint to winter break. I called Grandma Irene every Sunday. We talked about her book club. They were reading The Wren by Anne Enright, which she found beautiful and strange in equal measure. My class, Olivier had started writing short stories that he left on my desk, unsigned, apparently thinking I wouldn't know. The weather in Huntsville versus the weather in Sudbury. I didn't talk to my parents much. They'd returned from Portugal full of photographs and restaurant recommendations, and my mother had called in early November to tell me I was being dramatic. My father sent a text 3 days later that said we should talk and then didn't follow up. My brother called once on a Wednesday evening, sounding uncomfortable. He started to say something about how he hadn't really had a choice, and I let him finish, and then I said I understood that everyone makes choices and these had been his, and I didn't say it unkindly, I just said it. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I know." And I think maybe that landed in him somewhere real. I went back to Huntsville at Christmas. Just me, again. I took the train this time, which was slower but let me watch the snow-covered Ontario landscape roll past without having to concentrate on it. I brought gifts and a bottle of Niagara ice wine, and the ingredients to make the Norwegian butter cookies she'd mentioned were her favorite years ago and that I'd been meaning to make forever. She met me at the door with the porch light on. In February, she called me on a Sunday at a different time than usual. Late afternoon instead of morning. When I answered, she sounded normal, but she got to the point faster than she usually did. I had a bit of a scare Thursday, she said. Nothing dramatic, but I ended up at the hospital. I was already reaching for my keys. Sit down, Megan, it's fine, I'm home. My neighbor Dorothea drove me. A pause. It was my heart. Just a flutter, they said, an arrhythmia. They kept me overnight, ran some tests. Dr. Okafor says I need to take it more seriously. What does taking it more seriously look like? Medication. No more shoveling snow. I know. And she was quiet. Possibly less time alone. I taught the rest of the week and drove to Huntsville on Friday evening. I didn't call my parents first. I didn't ask anyone's permission. I found her in the living room, reading, a mug of tea on the side table, Dorothea's casserole on the counter in a dish covered with foil. The house was fine, she was fine. In the ways you can visually assess fine, but there was something different in her face when she looked up at me. Something that had stepped back slightly. You didn't have to come, she said. I know. I started coming every other weekend. Sudbury to Huntsville and back. My brother called in March to ask if I thought we should do something about Grandma Irene's situation. I said I was already doing something. He said he meant as a family. I said I'd let him know when I needed help. My parents visited twice in the spring, each time for a weekend, each time leaving with the faint air of people who had done their duty. Grandma was always perfectly gracious with them. She sat at the table and listened and answered their questions, and didn't say anything that wasn't true. But when they left, on the Sunday evening after their second visit, she and I sat on the back porch in the May sun, and she said, quietly, "Your mother means well." I know. But meaning well and doing well are different things. Yes, I said, they are. She looked out at the lake. You've been doing well, Megan. For a long time? Without much notice, I want you to know I've noticed. I didn't say anything for a moment because I was trying not to cry, which is a particular kind of struggle that I think anyone who has gone a long time without being acknowledged properly will understand. Thank you, I said finally. She nodded once. That was the end of it. She told me about the will in June. We were doing dishes together after dinner. I washed, she dried, which was the division of labor she preferred because it let her stay closer to where things were put away. She brought it up the way she brought up most important things, sideways, from an angle, as part of something else. I had a meeting with my lawyer last week, she said. She's been after me for years to get things properly organized. That's good, I said carefully. I've been sitting on a lot more than people realize. She dried a plate with the methodical attention she gave everything. When your grandfather sold his machine shop in 2001, we didn't spend most of it. That wasn't what we were raised to do. We put it in the market, conservatively, nothing clever, and we left it alone for 23 years. I kept washing. The house is paid for. The investments are worth considerably more now than they were. I'm not going to tell you the exact number because it would make this conversation awkward. But I am going to tell you that I have been thinking carefully about what I want to happen to it. I turned off the tap. Dried my hands. You don't have to tell me, Grandma. I want to, she said. Your mother and uncle will each receive something, enough to be meaningful. But I've been watching my family for a long time, Megan. and I know who has shown up. That matters. It has to matter, or what is any of it for? We stood in the kitchen in the quiet house. I'm not doing this because of Thanksgiving, she said. I want you to understand that. I'm doing it because of 20 years of Sundays. Because of every time you drove up here when you didn't have to. Because of the way you asked about my back when I didn't want you to notice. I looked at her for a long moment. Okay, I said. Okay, she agreed. She put the last dish away and then she said, Now, are you going to beat me at cribbage again or not? Probably not, I said. You'll cheat. I have never cheated at cribbage in my life, she said with complete seriousness. Come and find out. Grandma Irene passed away in September, 14 months after that Thanksgiving in October. It was her heart, in the end. The way she'd known it probably would be. She died at home in Huntsville, with Dorothea next door and her doctor on call and me on the phone. I was driving up, I was an hour away, I was going as fast as I was safely able, when Dorothea called and said I should pull over for a minute. I pulled over on a stretch of Highway 11 with trees on both sides, just beginning to turn. The same highway I'd driven up that first October. I sat in the car for a while. Then I drove the rest of the way. The house was quiet. The porch light was on. Someone had thought to leave it on for me, I realized. And I didn't know if that had been Grandma herself or Dorothea. And I didn't ask, because either way, it meant the same thing. My parents flew back from a trip to Vancouver Island. My uncle came from Calgary. My brother came with his girlfriend. The house was suddenly full in a way it hadn't been since I was a child. My mother cried genuinely. I want to be clear about that. Her grief was real. She had loved her mother, in her way. In the limited and self-involved way that some people love. The way that leaves gaps. I did the things that needed doing. I called the lawyer. I handled the insurance paperwork. I made sure there was food in the house for people to eat. I fielded the calls from Grandma's friends, the book club members, old colleagues from her teaching days, Gord from the farmer's market, who left a voicemail that I had to listen to 3 times because I kept not getting through it. My brother asked me quietly on the second day what the arrangements were. With the estate. The lawyer will be in touch, I said. Right, but do you? I genuinely don't know the specifics, I said, which was mostly true. I knew the shape. I didn't know the numbers. The lawyer will be in touch. He nodded. He didn't press. The reading of the will was in October, almost exactly a year after that Thanksgiving. My mother received $250,000 and some specific pieces of furniture and jewelry she'd always liked. My uncle received the same. My brother received a smaller amount, with a note that said Grandma hoped he'd use it toward a down payment. The house went to me. The investments went to me. A letter went to me, in her handwriting, which I have not shared with anyone and which I don't intend to. My mother was very quiet for a long time. Then she said, I didn't realize. I didn't say, you didn't show up. I didn't say 20 years of Sundays. I didn't say anything that I'll look back on and regret. I said, I know. My uncle left that afternoon. My brother hugged me at the door for a long time, and I think we were both thinking things we weren't going to say yet, but that's okay. Some things take time. My mother and I stood in Grandma Irene's kitchen, on opposite sides of the counter, in the house that was now mine. She knew what she was doing, my mother said finally. Not accusatory. Just arriving somewhere. She always did, I said. My mother looked around the kitchen, at the familiar cupboards, the window over the sink, with the lake just visible beyond it, the ceramic canisters on the counter my grandmother had bought at a craft fair in 1988. I should have been here more, she said. Yes, I said, you should have. She flinched a little at that. I let her. I'm not someone who believes in punishing people endlessly. I think there's a version of this story where my mother and I find our way back to something honest, something that doesn't require her to pretend she didn't make choices and me to pretend I wasn't shaped by them. I think it's possible. It will take time, and it will take her doing some of the work. And I'm not going to hurry it. But I also know this. I am 31 years old, and I have a house on a lake in Huntsville. And every Sunday, I sit at the kitchen table with coffee. And I think about all the Sunday mornings I sat in that same spot with my grandmother, while the blue jays came to the feeder and the lake reflected whatever the sky was doing. She gave me more than the house. I know that. She showed me what it looks like to live with your whole attention, to read every section of the newspaper, to teach for 31 years and love it, to make stuffing by feel and by smell and by something you can't quite name. I'm going to plant sage in the garden. She grew it from seed, in a south-facing window, and she told me once that it takes patience because sage is slow at the beginning, slower than you expect. And then one day it's simply there, and then you wonder how it was ever not there. I think about that a lot now. I turn the porch light on early when I'm expecting someone. It only takes a second, and it means you know you're expected. It means someone has thought of you before you arrived. I learned that from her. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that Thanksgiving. Not the surface of it, not the part where my family booked flights and didn't tell me, but the deeper mechanics of it. How choices accumulate, how the small ones, the ones that feel inconsequential in the moment, are the ones that end up mattering most. My mother didn't set out to lose anything. I genuinely believe that. She thought she was making a practical arrangement. Someone needed to be with Grandma Irene. I didn't have kids or a partner at the time. I was the logical candidate. She told herself it would work out fine, and in a narrow logistical sense, it did. I showed up. Grandma was cared for. No one had to cancel Portugal. What my mother didn't account for was what happens inside a relationship when someone shows up, again and again over years, when no one is watching and no one is keeping score. She didn't account for the Sunday phone calls, or the February drive up after the hospital scare, or the way Grandma Irene watched me reset the table for two on that first Thanksgiving evening without saying a word, just watching, understanding everything. You can't manufacture that kind of closeness after the fact. You can't decide to have it once you realize it matters. It grows in the ordinary moments, the ones that don't feel like they're building toward anything. Grandma Irene was one of the most clear-eyed people I've ever known. She'd been passed over for medical school because of her gender. She'd built a 31-year teaching career anyway, and she'd loved it, genuinely, not as a consolation. She understood something that I'm still learning, that integrity isn't what you do when there are consequences for doing otherwise. It's what you do in the Tuesday afternoons of your life, when nobody's grading you and nothing obvious is at stake. She watched her family for decades. She saw who called when it was convenient and who called when it wasn't. She saw who drove up on a Friday evening in February because a neighbor had mentioned her back was getting worse. She wasn't keeping score in a punishing way. She wasn't that kind of person, but she was paying attention, because she'd learned that attention is how you understand what someone is actually made of. What I got from her wasn't just a house on the lake. It was the model, the example of what it looks like to live with your whole attention turned outward, toward people, toward the world, toward the ordinary moments that are actually everything. She taught me, without ever framing it as a lesson, that showing up is its own kind of intelligence, that care is its own kind of strength. That the person who stays when it's inconvenient and asks about your back when you didn't want them to notice, that person is building something real, even when they don't know it yet. My family's choices had consequences they didn't expect, not because life is fair in any tidy, automatic way. It isn't, and I've never believed it is, but because Grandma Irene was paying attention, and she had the wisdom and the courage to act on what she saw. I think about that whenever I turn the porch light on early. It only takes a second. But it means someone has thought of you before you arrived. That's what she gave me, really. Not the house. That.